At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in late September, my phone buzzed with a text message that would unravel 15 years of lies, manipulation, and a family conspiracy so elaborate it had been hiding in plain sight since before my wedding day. The message came from my mother-in-law, Patricia Ashford, the woman who had smiled at me across the rehearsal dinner table 12 years ago while secretly plotting to destroy my marriage from the inside out. The woman who had whispered concerns about whether I was really the right fit for her son while hosting elaborate family gatherings where I was systematically excluded from private conversations and inside jokes I would never understand. The message contained a single image, a grainy black and white ultrasound photo with a yellow arrow pointing to a tiny bean-shaped figure barely visible against the textured background. Underneath, Patricia had typed 7 words that she clearly believed would devastate me completely. Finally, a real grandchild. She's pregnant. I sat there in the darkness of my home office, the one space in this house that felt entirely mine, staring at that ultrasound image on my phone screen. The soft blue glow illuminated my face while the rest of the room remained wrapped in shadow. Outside my window, the suburban street was completely silent, the kind of deep quiet that settles over neighborhoods after midnight when even the most restless dogs have finally surrendered to sleep. My first response was not shock or hurt or the crushing emotional devastation Patricia had clearly anticipated when she pressed send on that message. My first response was a cold, clarifying rage that sharpened rather than clouded my thinking. Because unlike Patricia Ashford, who had spent the past 12 years underestimating me, dismissing my intelligence, treating me like an obstacle to be managed rather than a person worthy of basic human respect, I knew something she did not know. I knew about the money. But before I explain about the money, before I detail exactly how I dismantled Patricia Ashford's entire carefully constructed family empire using nothing but patience, documentation, and her own spectacular arrogance against her, I need to back up. I need to explain how I ended up married into a family that viewed me as fundamentally unsuitable, how I spent 12 years being systematically gaslighted and marginalized, and how that single ultrasound photo at 11:47 p.m. became the catalyst for the most satisfying revenge I have ever witnessed. My name is Rebecca Ashford, though Patricia has never once in 12 years used my full hyphenated name. To her, I have always been just Rebecca, or occasionally Michael's wife. When she needed to refer to me in conversations with her social circle, but could not quite bring herself to acknowledge my actual relationship to the family she controlled with an iron grip wrapped in expensive cashmere and false Southern charm. I am 38 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a firm that specializes in uncovering financial fraud in complex corporate structures. I have a master's degree in accounting from Columbia, a certification in fraud examination, and 15 years of experience tracking money through offshore accounts, shell corporations, and deliberately obscure paper trails designed by people who believe they are smarter than everyone else in the room. This professional background becomes critically important later in this story, but Patricia never bothered to understand what I actually did for work. To her, I was simply that accountant girl Michael had inexplicably chosen to marry despite her very clear preference for Stephanie Morrison, the daughter of Patricia's closest friend from the country club. Stephanie with her trust fund and her junior league credentials and her family connections that stretched back 4 generations in Charleston society. I met Michael Ashford at a conference in Boston during the winter of my late 20s. I was there presenting a paper on detecting financial irregularities in family-owned businesses. He was there representing his family's commercial real estate development company, attending panels on sustainable urban planning and innovative financing structures. We had coffee after my presentation because he claimed my analysis of how family businesses hide assets during inheritance disputes was the most interesting thing he had heard all weekend. We had dinner that same evening because neither of us wanted the conversation to end. We had breakfast the next morning because we had stayed up talking in the hotel lobby until 3 in the morning about everything from architecture to philosophy to whether the Oxford comma actually mattered in professional writing. Michael was different then. Or perhaps more accurately, I believed he was different because I was seeing him outside the gravitational field of his mother's influence. Away from Charleston and the Ashford family expectations and the social circles where Patricia reigned as an unquestioned authority on taste, propriety, and who deserved to be included in their exclusive world. He was thoughtful in small ways that made me believe we were building something genuine. He remembered that I took my coffee black with exactly 1 sugar. He noticed when I was stressed about work deadlines and showed up at my apartment with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. He listened when I talked about my parents' immigration story, about how my father had come to this country with $200 and an engineering degree that American companies initially refused to recognize, about how my mother had worked 3 jobs while going to nursing school at night so they could build something better for their children. We got married 14 months after that conference in Boston. The ceremony took place at a boutique hotel in Charleston that Patricia had selected, with a guest list Patricia had curated, following traditions Patricia insisted were essential for a proper Ashford family wedding. My parents attended with quiet dignity, despite the way Patricia's friends looked at them during the rehearsal dinner like they were exotic curiosities rather than the bride's family. My father wore his best suit, the one he reserved for the most important occasions. He walked me down the aisle with his hand steady on my arm, his face carefully composed into an expression of pride and joy that I only later recognized as also containing deep concern about the family I was marrying into. My mother smiled throughout the ceremony, but I caught her exchanging looks with my father during the reception that communicated entire conversations in the silent language parents develop over decades of partnership. They did not say anything explicit about their reservations. Asian parents, especially immigrant parents of their generation, rarely do. But they did not need to articulate their concerns for me to understand, years later when everything fell apart, that they had seen exactly what I was walking into even when I was too optimistic or too in love or too determinately hopeful to recognize it myself. The warning signs were there from the beginning. I just chose to interpret them as natural adjustment friction rather than deliberate exclusion. The way Patricia would plan family gatherings and forget to inform me of the details until the day before, then express surprise that I had made other commitments. The way she would make comments about Michael's ex-girlfriend Stephanie with wistful nostalgia, followed by quick assurances that she was sure this would work out fine too. The way she would ask me intrusive questions about our family planning timeline during holiday dinners, in front of the entire extended family, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that communicated she found my answer, whatever it might be, inadequate. "You know Michael has always wanted children," she would say, as though I might have somehow forgotten this fact or needed Patricia to remind me of my obligations. The Ashford family line is very important. We have a legacy to maintain. What I did not know during those early years, what I would not discover until much later when I finally started investigating the family finances with the same meticulous attention I applied to my professional cases, was that Patricia's concern about legacy and family lines had very little to do with emotional attachment to grandchildren and everything to do with control over the family trust. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, I need to explain about the 3 years of fertility treatments that nearly destroyed me, and how Patricia weaponized my grief for her own purposes. Michael and I started trying to have children about 2 years into our marriage. This was not some desperate attempt to fix problems or cement a relationship that was already failing. This was a mutual decision based on genuine desire to build a family together. We were both in our early 30s, financially stable, professionally established, and ready for the chaos and joy that children bring. Except it did not happen. Month after month, I would take those pregnancy tests with hands that shook slightly from hope and anxiety. Month after month, I would see that single line appear and feel something inside me crack just a little bit more. Michael was supportive during this time, at least in the beginning. He would hold me when I cried, make reassuring sounds about how it would happen when it was meant to happen, promise that we would figure this out together. After a year of trying without success, we consulted a fertility specialist. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was in her early 50s, with steel gray hair and a direct communication style that I appreciated after months of well-meaning, but ultimately useless advice from friends and family. She ordered a comprehensive battery of tests for both of us, checking hormone levels and genetic markers and all the various factors that contribute to reproductive success or failure. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon in late spring. I remember the date exactly because it was Michael's birthday, and I had been hoping the results would be good news we could celebrate together. Instead, Dr. Mitchell delivered information that reshaped my entire understanding of our situation. "The issue is not with you, Rebecca," she said, looking at me directly across her desk while Michael sat beside me in his chair, his face already showing signs of the defensive posture he adopted whenever he felt criticized. "Your fertility markers are all within normal ranges. You have regular cycles, healthy hormone levels, no structural issues that would prevent conception. The problem is with Michael's sperm count and motility." She went on to explain in precise medical terminology that Michael's fertility was significantly compromised. Not impossible, but requiring intervention and treatment and possibly assisted reproductive technologies if we wanted to conceive. The percentage chances she quoted were discouraging but not hopeless. With treatment, we might achieve pregnancy naturally. With IVF, our chances improved substantially. Michael was devastated. I watched him process this information, saw his face cycle through denial and anger, and something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. Men's identities are so often tied to virility, to reproductive capability, to the biological markers that society tells them define masculinity. Learning that his body was the obstacle to the children we both wanted clearly damaged something fundamental in how he viewed himself. I tried to reassure him that it did not matter whose biology was the issue, that we would handle this together, that treatment options existed, and we had resources to pursue them. But something had shifted in our relationship from that moment forward. Michael became withdrawn, less communicative, more prone to spending evenings in his home office rather than sharing space with me. And Patricia, when she learned about the fertility issues, made everything catastrophically worse. I was naive enough to believe that sharing our situation with Michael's family might generate support and understanding. That Patricia might soften her perpetual criticism of me when she learned that her son, not me, was the reason grandchildren had not yet materialized. I was spectacularly wrong about this assumption. Patricia took the news about Michael's fertility issues and somehow, through mental gymnastics I still do not fully understand, transformed it into further evidence of my inadequacy. "This must be so stressful for Michael," she would say during family dinners, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy that barely concealed her accusation. "Having a wife who cannot give him children naturally. You know how important family is to the Ashfords." When I would try to correct this deliberately distorted version of our situation, would try to explain that the fertility issues stemmed from Michael's biology, not mine, Patricia would wave away my words like they were irrelevant technicalities. "Medical issues can be so complicated," she would say vaguely. "What matters is that you support Michael through this difficult time. A good wife makes her husband feel like a man regardless of circumstances." The gaslighting was sophisticated and relentless. Patricia would make comments to extended family members that carefully implied the fertility problems were mine, while maintaining just enough ambiguity that she could claim innocence if directly challenged. She would suggest to Michael, in private conversations I only learned about later, that perhaps I was not trying hard enough with treatments, that perhaps I was not really as committed to having children as I claimed, that perhaps my career ambitions were interfering with my biological obligations. We went through 3 rounds of IVF over the next 2 years. Each round was physically exhausting, emotionally devastating, and financially draining despite our relatively comfortable economic situation. The hormone treatments made me feel like I was losing my mind, my body reacting to artificial chemical manipulation in ways that left me alternately euphoric and despairing sometimes within the same hour. The first round failed completely. No viable embryos developed to the stage where they could be transferred. I spent a week after receiving that news lying in bed, unable to muster the energy to go to work or engage with the world or do anything except stare at the ceiling and mourn the children who had not even had a chance to exist. The second round produced 2 embryos that looked promising. Dr. Mitchell transferred both, and for 2 weeks I allowed myself to hope. I researched nursery designs. I made lists of potential names. I imagined holding a baby, feeding a baby, watching Michael become a father. Then my period arrived with its usual cruel precision, and I knew before taking the blood test that this round had also failed. Patricia's response to each failed cycle followed a predictable pattern. She would call Michael, not me, to offer sympathy that somehow always included subtle implications that perhaps we should consider adoption, or perhaps Michael should think about whether staying in this marriage was really in his best interests, or perhaps some women simply were not meant to be mothers. The third IVF round was our last attempt. Dr. Mitchell had explained that our odds decreased with each failed cycle, that my body and Michael's remaining viable sperm samples were both showing signs of diminishing returns, that we should seriously consider whether continuing treatment was the best choice for our physical and emotional health. That third cycle produced one embryo. Just one. Dr. Mitchell transferred it on a Tuesday morning, and I spent the next 2 weeks in a state of suspended animation, afraid to hope but unable to stop myself from imagining that maybe this time would be different. The pregnancy test on day 14 showed positive. Faintly positive, but positive. I stared at those 2 lines with tears streaming down my face, hardly believing that after everything, it had finally worked. I called Michael at his office, barely able to speak through my crying, and told him we were pregnant. He came home early from work. We held each other in our kitchen, both of us crying, both of us overwhelmed with relief and joy and the cautious hope that maybe our nightmare was finally ending. We did not tell anyone immediately, superstitious about announcing before we had confirmation that the pregnancy was progressing normally. But privately, in our home, we allowed ourselves to imagine the future we had been fighting for. That pregnancy lasted exactly 6 weeks and 3 days. I started bleeding on a Sunday morning while we were having breakfast. By evening, the cramping had become intense enough that we went to the emergency room, where an ultrasound confirmed what we already knew. The embryo had stopped developing. My body was rejecting the pregnancy. The miscarriage was physically painful and emotionally devastating in ways I lack adequate language to describe. But what made it unbearable was Patricia's reaction when we finally told the family what had happened. "Well," she said, settling back into her chair in the formal living room of the Ashford family estate, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sympathy she had perfected over years of delivering cutting remarks wrapped in Southern politeness. "Perhaps this is nature's way of telling you something, Rebecca. Not every woman is meant to be a mother. And honestly, maybe it is for the best. Michael needs a partner who can give him children, not someone whose career has always come first." I stared at her, genuinely unable to process that she had just said those words out loud, that she had taken our most painful loss and weaponized it to suggest I was biologically and morally inadequate. Michael sat beside me on the couch, and I waited for him to defend me, to tell his mother that her comment was cruel and inappropriate and completely unacceptable. He said nothing. The text message came from Patricia's personal cell phone, the number I had saved in my contacts years ago and had grown to associate with stress and manipulation. The notification lit up my phone screen while I was working late in my home office, reviewing financial documents for a case involving a family-owned manufacturing company whose younger generation suspected their elderly patriarch had been systematically draining assets to fund a secret second life in another state. I picked up my phone expecting another one of Patricia's passive-aggressive reminders about upcoming family obligations or subtle criticisms of my recent choices. Instead, I found that ultrasound photo with its yellow arrow pointing to the tiny developing fetus barely visible against the grainy black and white background. Below the image, Patricia had written, "Finally, a real grandchild. She's pregnant. Daniel called with the wonderful news tonight. We're all so thrilled. I thought you should know, since you and Michael won't be providing any heirs for the Ashford family legacy. Maybe this will help you understand that some women are simply meant to be mothers while others are meant to focus on their careers. No judgment, just reality. We'll be celebrating at the estate this weekend. You and Michael are welcome to attend, of course, though I understand if this is too painful for you." I read the message 3 times, my analytical mind cataloging every deliberate cruelty embedded in Patricia's carefully chosen words. The phrase real grandchild, as though Michael and I had somehow been producing fake children in our unsuccessful attempts at fertility treatment. The false sympathy about career focus that was actually condemnation of my professional success. The invitation extended with full knowledge that accepting would mean watching Patricia celebrate Daniel and his girlfriend Natasha while reinforcing my status as the inadequate daughter-in-law who had failed at her most fundamental obligation. But underlying all of Patricia's casual cruelty was something she did not know I understood. Something I had discovered exactly 4 months earlier when my professional instincts had finally overcome my desire to trust that my husband's family operated with basic honesty and integrity. I knew about the money. I knew about the Ashford family trust. I knew about the very specific conditions that governed inheritance distributions. And I knew that Patricia's celebration of this pregnancy had absolutely nothing to do with her desire for grandchildren and everything to do with securing Daniel's access to $8 million. Let me explain how I discovered this information, because it is important to understand that I did not go looking for family secrets with the intention of destroying anyone. I stumbled across evidence of financial irregularities the same way I always do in my professional work, by noticing small inconsistencies that do not quite align with publicly stated facts, and then following those inconsistencies until the full pattern reveals itself. It started with a casual conversation at Thanksgiving dinner approximately 6 months before Patricia sent that ultrasound photo. We were all gathered at the Ashford family estate, that sprawling property just outside Charleston with its manicured gardens and antebellum architecture that Patricia loved to showcase during carefully curated social events. Michael's father, William Ashford, was discussing some recent charitable donations the family had made, talking about their commitment to preserving Charleston's historic architecture and supporting local arts organizations. He mentioned specific amounts donated to various foundations, numbers that caught my attention because they seemed extraordinarily large for a family whose commercial real estate business had been struggling over the past several years. I am a forensic accountant. Noticing numerical inconsistencies is literally what I do for a living. William had quoted donation amounts totaling nearly $500,000 distributed across multiple organizations during the current fiscal year. These were not small philanthropic gestures. These were substantial charitable contributions that would typically require significant liquid assets or careful tax planning to execute without creating financial strain. But I knew from conversations over the past several years that the Ashford commercial real estate development business had been facing serious challenges. Construction costs had increased while rental demand in their target markets had softened. Several major projects had been delayed or canceled entirely when financing fell through. Michael himself had mentioned during private conversations that his father was concerned about cash flow and was considering selling some properties to maintain operational flexibility. So where was this $500,000 in charitable donations coming from? I let the question sit in the back of my mind for a few weeks, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid or overly suspicious or allowing my professional skepticism to contaminate my personal relationships. But the inconsistency kept nagging at me, the same way a small crack in a building foundation nags at an inspector who knows that minor structural flaws often indicate major problems hidden beneath the surface. Finally, I did what I always do when confronted with financial irregularities that do not make sense. I started researching, not with any particular agenda beyond satisfying my own curiosity and resolving the inconsistency that was bothering my analytical mind. South Carolina has relatively robust public records regarding charitable donations made by private foundations. The Ashford Family Foundation was registered as a private entity, which meant certain filings were required and accessible through state databases. I spent an evening reviewing their submitted documents, cross-referencing donation amounts and timing against what I knew about the family business's financial situation. That is when I noticed the first serious red flag. The Ashford Family Foundation had substantially more assets than I had expected based on my general understanding of the family's wealth. Not millions more, but tens of millions more. The discrepancy was significant enough that it could not be explained by conservative investments or appreciated real estate holdings or any of the normal mechanisms through which family wealth grows over time. I expanded my research, pulling corporate filings for the Ashford Commercial Real Estate Development Company, reviewing property records, examining tax assessments on holdings I knew the family owned. The picture that emerged was of a family business that was moderately successful but not extraordinarily wealthy, operating with reasonable profit margins but substantial overhead costs, maintaining adequate cash flow but nothing that would justify the foundation assets I had discovered, which meant the money in the family foundation was coming from somewhere else. I spent the next 2 months conducting an investigation that I kept entirely separate from my marriage and family obligations. I did not tell Michael what I was researching. I did not ask Patricia or William direct questions that might alert them to my interest in their financial structure. I simply did what I do professionally, followed the money through public records, corporate filings, property transactions, and carefully obscured paper trails until the full picture revealed itself. What I discovered was elegant in its simplicity and absolutely devastating in its implications. The Ashford family wealth did not come primarily from their commercial real estate business, which was essentially a moderately successful venture that provided good income, but not generational wealth. The real money came from a trust established by Michael's grandfather, Robert Ashford, who had died 15 years before I met Michael. Robert Ashford had been extraordinarily successful in manufacturing during the post-war boom years, building a company that produced industrial components for aerospace and automotive applications. He sold that company in the early 1980s for an amount that would be worth well over $100 million in today's money. Rather than distributing this wealth immediately to his children, Robert established a sophisticated trust structure designed to preserve the family fortune across multiple generations. The trust had very specific conditions governing how and when money would be distributed to Robert's descendants. I found a copy of the trust document through careful examination of estate records from Robert's death, filed in probate court and publicly accessible though rarely reviewed by anyone who was not directly involved in the family finances. Reading through that trust document, I began to understand Patricia's behavior toward me with sudden, crystalline clarity. The trust specified that primary distributions would be made to Robert's grandchildren when they reached age 35, provided they met certain conditions that Robert had deemed important for preserving family values and ensuring his wealth supported stable, productive lives. One of those conditions was that grandchildren must be married with at least one biological child to receive their full inheritance distribution. Grandchildren who reached 35 without meeting this condition would receive only a minimal annual stipend from the trust rather than their full share of the principal. The trust document specified that this requirement existed to encourage family stability and ensure that Robert's wealth supported the continuation of the Ashford family line. Michael was 40 years old. He had passed the age 35 threshold 7 years ago without producing any children, which meant he was currently receiving only a minimal distribution from his grandfather's trust rather than his full $8 million inheritance. Daniel was 33 years old. He would reach the critical age 35 threshold in less than 2 years. If he wanted to receive his full inheritance, he needed to be married with at least one biological child before his 35th birthday. Suddenly, Patricia's entire campaign against me made perfect sense. She did not actually care whether I could have children or whether Michael and I had a happy marriage or whether I was a good wife by any reasonable standard. She cared about controlling access to the family trust money. She cared about ensuring that her sons received their full inheritance distributions rather than being limited to minimal annual stipends because they failed to meet their grandfather's archaic conditions. And she had apparently determined that I was an obstacle to this goal. That my fertility issues and my career focus and my general unwillingness to subordinate my entire existence to producing an Ashford heir made me a liability rather than an asset in Patricia's financial planning. The ultrasound photo she sent me at 11:47 p.m. was not just cruel mockery of my inability to have children. It was a victory celebration. Daniel and his girlfriend Natasha were pregnant. If they married before Daniel's 35th birthday and their child was born, Daniel would satisfy his grandfather's trust conditions and receive his full $8 million inheritance. Patricia's message to me was clear. She had won. Despite my presence in the family, Despite my marriage to Michael, Patricia had successfully secured at least one grandchild who would unlock access to the family wealth. I was now completely irrelevant to her plans. What Patricia did not know was that I understood the entire financial structure she was manipulating. What she did not know was that I had spent the past 4 months documenting irregularities in how the trust was being administered. What she did not know was that she had just handed me the perfect opportunity to dismantle everything she had carefully constructed. Because while I was researching the family trust conditions, I had discovered something else. Something that Patricia and William clearly hoped would never be noticed by anyone outside the family. Something that constituted serious legal violations with the potential for criminal prosecution if reported to the appropriate authorities. The Ashford Family Foundation was being used to hide income from the family trust. William and Patricia were systematically moving money from the trust into the foundation using carefully structured transactions designed to look like legitimate charitable activities while actually providing personal benefits to family members. They were claiming tax deductions for charitable donations while simultaneously maintaining effective control over those funds through the foundation structure. This is called self-dealing, and it is absolutely illegal when done through private foundations. The IRS takes a very dim view of people using charitable structures to evade taxes while maintaining personal access to foundation assets. I had been documenting this activity for months, carefully building a case file with the same meticulous attention I would apply to any professional investigation. I had transaction records showing money moving from the trust to the foundation. I had foundation filings showing expenditures that clearly benefited family members despite being characterized as charitable activities. I had enough evidence to demonstrate a clear pattern of illegal behavior spanning multiple years. I had been uncertain about what to do with this information. Using it would destroy Michael's family relationships, would expose serious financial crimes, would potentially send Patricia and William to prison for tax fraud and illegal administration of charitable foundations. Part of me wanted to simply keep the information as insurance, a private understanding that I held power over the family that had treated me so cruelly, without ever actually deploying that power in ways that could not be reversed. But Patricia's text message at 11:47 p.m., with its ultrasound photo and its casual cruelty and its obvious celebration that she had finally secured an heir who would unlock the family wealth, clarified my decision completely. I was going to expose everything. I was going to report the foundation irregularities to the IRS and state authorities. I was going to file for divorce from Michael and ensure that the reasons for our separation were documented with absolute clarity. And I was going to watch Patricia Ashford's carefully constructed empire collapse around her while she finally understood that treating people as disposable eventually means discovering that you yourself are disposable. I sat in my home office, that ultrasound photo still glowing on my phone screen, and felt something cold and focused settle into place. The same feeling I get during professional investigations when all the pieces finally align, and I can see exactly how to build an irrefutable case that will withstand any defense or counter-narrative. I typed a response to Patricia's message. Just 7 words, chosen deliberately for maximum impact. Congratulations. I've informed the IRS about the foundation. I hit send before the part of me that wanted to avoid confrontation or maintain family peace or somehow preserve the possibility of reconciliation could override my decision. The message showed as delivered immediately, then read within seconds. I imagined Patricia in her bedroom at the family estate, probably settled into her expensive bedding with her phone in hand, expecting me to respond with pain or jealousy or quiet acceptance of my defeat. Instead, receiving a message that would make her heart race with genuine fear for the first time in years. Then I did what I had been planning for months. I opened my carefully organized case file containing all the documentation of the Ashford Family Foundation's illegal activities. I attached comprehensive evidence to a formal complaint letter I had drafted weeks earlier. And I filed reports with the Internal Revenue Service, the South Carolina Department of Revenue, and the State Attorney General's office. Each report was thorough, professional, supported by extensive documentation, and absolutely devastating in its implications for Patricia and William Ashford. I included transaction records showing money moving illegally from the trust to the foundation. I included foundation filings demonstrating clear self-dealing and personal benefit from assets that were supposed to support charitable activities. I included correspondence that demonstrated Patricia and William's awareness that their activities were potentially illegal. I filed all 3 reports electronically, receiving confirmation numbers and automated responses promising that my complaints would be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. Then I sat back in my chair and waited for Patricia to call. The call came exactly 4 minutes later. My phone screen lit up with Patricia's name and her contact photo, a professional headshot she had commissioned last year that showed her in pearls and perfectly coiffed hair, the visual embodiment of Charleston society respectability. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking small satisfaction in making her wait, in forcing her to sit with her panic for those extra seconds before I granted her access to demand explanations. "Patricia," I said calmly when I finally accepted the call, my voice flat and professional, devoid of the emotion she probably expected. "What have you done?" she demanded immediately, her voice pitched higher than her usual carefully controlled register. The Southern politeness had evaporated entirely, replaced by naked fear and rage. "What did you just do, Rebecca? What did that text message mean?" "I think my message was quite clear," I replied, still maintaining that same professional calm I used during difficult conversations with clients who had just learned their business partners had been embezzling funds or their elderly parents had been manipulated into signing away their estates. I filed formal complaints with the IRS and state revenue authorities regarding irregularities in the Ashford Family Foundation's financial activities. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, sharp and shallow, hear what might have been William's voice in the background asking what was happening. "You cannot do this," Patricia finally said, her voice now containing that particular tone of aristocratic outrage she used when someone violated her expectations about proper social hierarchies. "You have no right to interfere in family financial matters. You are not even really part of this family. You are just some girl Michael made the mistake of marrying who has never understood how things work in families like ours." "Actually, I have every right," I replied, my voice remaining calm despite the rage I felt at her dismissive characterization of our 12-year marriage. When I discovered evidence of illegal financial activities, I had both a legal and ethical obligation to report them to the appropriate authorities. The Ashford Family Foundation has been engaging in systematic self-dealing, using charitable structures to hide income from the family trust while providing personal benefits to family members. "That's illegal, Patricia. Seriously illegal." "You do not know what you are talking about," she shot back, but I could hear the fear underneath her bluster. "You are just some accountant who thinks she understands complex financial arrangements. Our family's financial advisors are the best in Charleston. Everything we have done is perfectly legal and properly documented." "Your family's financial advisors are either incompetent or complicit," I said, feeling my professional pride bristle at her implication that I did not understand what I was doing. "I am not just some accountant, Patricia. I am a certified fraud examiner who specializes in uncovering financial crimes in complex family structures. I have spent the past 4 months documenting every illegal transaction your foundation has executed. I have transaction records, foundation filings, correspondence demonstrating awareness of potential illegality, everything needed to build an irrefutable case for tax fraud and illegal administration of charitable assets." Another silence, longer this time. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had changed tactics, shifting from outrage to negotiation. "Rebecca, you need to think very carefully about what you are doing," she said, her southern accent becoming more pronounced as she slipped into the mode of gracious reasonableness that she used when trying to manipulate people into compliance. "If you pursue this complaint, you will destroy this family. You will hurt Michael, who has never done anything but love you. You will damage Daniel's future. You will create a scandal that will follow all of us for the rest of our lives. Is that really what you want? Do you really want to be the person who destroyed an entire family out of spite and jealousy over a baby?" I let her words hang in the air for a moment, the same way I would allow a client to finish their desperate rationalizations before presenting the evidence that dismantled their defenses. Then I laughed, not the bitter, dramatic laugh of someone unhinged, but the short, precise sound of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the other side to realize it. Spite and jealousy? I repeated, my tone measured. Patricia, this isn't about the baby. This is about the fact that you've spent 12 years treating me like an inconvenience because I wouldn't pop out an heir to unlock your precious trust fund. You turned my miscarriages into ammunition, convinced Michael I was the problem, and now you're celebrating Daniel's pregnancy like it's your personal lottery ticket. But let's be clear, the IRS doesn't care about your family drama. They care about the $2.3 million you've siphoned through the foundation in the last 5 years alone, money that paid for your European cruises, William's vintage car collection, and the charitable renovations to the estate that somehow only benefited Ashfords. I heard her sharp intake of breath, the kind that comes when someone realizes the trap has already sprung. In the background, William was shouting now, demanding to know what I had on them. Patricia shushed him with a hissed command that carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. You're bluffing, she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. You wouldn't destroy Michael like this. He loves you. He'd never. Michael stopped loving me the day he let you call me a failure in that living room, I interrupted. And he stopped mattering the moment I realized he knew about the trust conditions and never told me. Did you think I wouldn't notice how he avoided the topic of money for years? How he changed the subject whenever I asked about the foundation's donations? I have the emails, Patricia. The ones where you instructed your advisor to structure the transfers carefully to avoid unnecessary scrutiny. The ones where William asked if the IRS would really audit a family like ours. I have everything. The line went quiet again, but this time it was the silence of surrender. I could picture her in that oversized bedroom, the ultrasound photo probably still open on her phone, her empire crumbling in real time. What do you want? She finally whispered, the question every manipulator asks when their leverage evaporates. Nothing you can give me, I said. The reports are filed. The evidence is with authorities who don't negotiate with Charleston society queens. But since you asked so nicely, here's what happens next. The IRS will freeze the foundation's assets within 72 hours. They'll audit every transaction back to 2018. William will face penalties that exceed the foundation's current balance. And you, Patricia? You'll learn what it feels like to be investigated by people who don't care about your junior league credentials. I paused, letting that sink in, then delivered the final piece. Oh, and Daniel's inheritance? The trust requires a biological child born to a married couple. Natasha's due in March, yes? But Daniel's 35th birthday is February 14th. Even if they rush a courthouse wedding tomorrow, the baby won't be born in time. The trust principle stays locked. Your real grandchild arrives too late to matter. There was a crash on the other end, her phone hitting the hardwood floor, perhaps, or the crystal decanter she'd been clutching. Then William's voice, closer now, panicked and pleading. Rebecca, please. I ended the call. The fallout was spectacular in its precision. The IRS audit began 3 days later. Foundation assets were frozen. William's vintage cars were seized to cover initial penalties. Patricia's social circle, those same women who'd smiled politely while excluding me from conversations, began distancing themselves with the speed of rats fleeing a sinking ship. Michael showed up at our house the morning after Patricia's call, his face pale and unshaven, carrying the weight of 12 years of cowardice in his eyes. He begged me to withdraw the complaints, promised he'd leave his parents, promised anything if I'd just make it stop. I handed him the divorce papers I'd had drawn up months earlier. The settlement was generous, our joint assets divided equitably, no alimony requested, but included one non-negotiable condition: he would receive nothing from the family trust. Ever. I'd already consulted the trust attorney, an old college friend who'd taken my call with professional interest rather than family loyalty, and confirmed that Michael's failure to meet the conditions by age 35 was permanent. No appeals. No exceptions. Daniel and Natasha married in a rushed ceremony at the courthouse, Natasha's ultrasound photo serving as their wedding backdrop in Patricia's desperate social media post attempting to maintain appearances. The baby, a girl, was born healthy in March. Patricia got her grandchild, but Daniel received only the minimal stipend. $8 million remained forever out of reach. The criminal charges came 6 months later. Self-dealing, tax evasion, conspiracy. William took the fall hardest. His name splashed across local papers as the face of Charleston elite fraud. Patricia avoided prison through a plea deal that required her to pay $4.2 million in restitution and perform 500 hours of community service. Irony of ironies, at the women's shelter she'd once claimed to support while funneling its donations into her personal accounts. I sold the house, moved to Manhattan, and took a senior partnership at my firm. My parents flew in for the promotion dinner, my father squeezing my hand under the table with the same steady grip he'd used walking me down the aisle all those years ago. This time, there was no concern in his eyes. Only pride. The last I heard of Patricia, she was living in a condo half the size of her former guest house, her pearls sold to cover legal fees, her social invitations dried up like the Charleston humidity in winter. Rumor has it she still sends ultrasound announcements to anyone who'll listen, but now they're just desperate bids for relevance from a woman who finally understands that legacies built on manipulation don't endure. They crumble. And sometimes, the person you dismissed as just some accountant is the one holding the detonator.